Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I am Cameron Bertuzzi, and today I've got two esteemed guests with me that have been on the show a couple times before. Actually, this is their what time is this? The third or fourth time that you guys have been on? Well, today what we're doing is we're reviewing a movie that just came out about a week ago, as of the time of this recording, which is Oppenheimer. So it's one of the biggest movies that's come out in recent times. And even some people are saying that it's like the most important movie of like the century so far. I've seen that. I can't remember the citation there, but I've seen stuff like that on social media and on blog posts and news articles and stuff. People saying that this is a really, really important movie. And so we thought that it would be a good idea to watch this movie, review it from a sort of Christian perspective, some of the main like moral things that it brings up, because it's a movie. Oppenheimer is this character who invented the atom bomb, or was at least in charge of this Manhattan Project, who they developed the atom bomb, and then it was dropped, I think, within a week or a month later on Hiroshima, and then again on Nagasaki. So this is just raises all sorts of moral or ethical questions or concerns. And so we thought it would be helpful to review this movie from a Christian perspective. What we're going to do to start, though, is just share our overall thoughts of the movie. And so we'll move through that. We've got about 6 things we kind of want to get through today. So we'll start, though, with our overall impressions of the movie. So let's start. I'm going to pass it over to Jimmy, and then we'll go to Tyler. So what were your sort of personal impressions of the movie?
Well, I enjoyed it. I thought it was very well made. The film is by Christopher Nolan, who wrote and directed it, and he's known for other films that are intellectually challenging, like he did Inception. And you can tell that this is a Christopher Nolan movie because he uses, like Citizen Kane, he uses a non-chronological sequencing of the story. He jumps back and forth between different periods in history and lets them shed light on each other, which is the same thing Orson Welles did in Citizen Kane. So it's more challenging than a simple, straightforward plot. But I thought it was very well done. Now, I've heard some people say that it's also 3 hours long. I've heard some people say that they liked the first 2 hours, which basically gets us up through the successful Trinity test of the first atomic bomb. But then they didn't like the last hour because it focuses more on the problems that Robert Oppenheimer encountered after the Trinity test. You know, his guilt over his ambiguous feelings and guilt over the dropping of the bombs on Japan, and his being stripped of his security clearance in the 1950s. And it focuses on this more personal side of things that's not as driven by the race to build the bomb. I didn't have that experience. I thought it was riveting from beginning to end. Now, partly that may be because I've read a lot about this period in history. I've read, for example, the book The Making of the Atomic Bomb, which is often considered one of the best science history books ever. And I've also read the book that the film is directly based on, which is a book called American Prometheus. That's a biography of Robert Oppenheimer. But I thought it was very intricately structured. I thought it was intellectually engaging, and I thought it was riveting all the way through.
Yeah, my thoughts on the movie, and then we'll switch over to Tyler. My biggest impression from the movie was the one that you kind of mentioned already, was that it just seemed a little bit long. Like it seemed a little bit drawn out, which I think is honestly probably intentional. Like he wants it to sort of drag on, and you can kind of feel that as they're going through this interview process. And there was, I think actually one of my favorite parts of the movie was from the interview, was when the wife, I can't remember the wife's name, Emily Blunt is the actor or actress.
Mrs. Oppenheimer.
Mrs. Oppenheimer. She is being cross-examined, and that part was really, really good. It was one of my favorite parts of the movie. So
yeah, but if I can just add on a little bit to that. So I think that what Nolan wanted was this to have a kind of meditative structure, and to where you kind of, it part of it is a slow burn, but
Yeah.
that moment is riveting where during the hearings on whether Oppenheimer is going to keep his security clearance, he's called in to a closed door session, and he's got his lawyer there representing him, and his lawyer is not sure if putting his wife on the stand is going to be good, especially
Hmm.
because she's been portrayed as having a problematic or a not fully happy relationship with him,
Hmm.
and she's also been portrayed as drinking quite a lot. And so we're very uncertain. And even out the gate, she stumbles a little bit when they start questioning her. But then it's like a switch clicks in her head and she wipes the floor with the lawyer who's questioning her. And it is a riveting moment.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite. It actually kind of reminded me of some other dialogue that I've seen in other movies from, and now this director is completely absent from my mind. But when you have a dialogue like this, is just, to me, that part was probably one of the most riveting parts of the movie. But I did feel like it was a little bit long. I felt like they could have made the same points in a shorter amount of time. But is that really what's going to make a movie good? I'm not sure. But what the movie really did for me was it made me start to consider, like, we have these things that are, these nuclear weapons that exist, and I was looking up all of this data after the movie, partly in preparation for the stream, but partly just because this movie encouraged me, so to speak, to start to really care about this issue, which I haven't really done that before, which I think is part of the purpose of making this, is that they wanted to highlight and also defend Oppenheimer, but they wanted to highlight this important issue. And so I just was looking it up, and there's I think the U.S. has got 5,000 nuclear warheads, and Russia's got like 6,500, something like that, active ones. Like, it used to be more, and a lot of them have been dismantled, but now there's still like 5,000 in the U.S. and 6,000 in Russia, and then there's more scattered throughout the world. But it's just mind blowing to. And then I was looking up like the destruction that these things can, because in the movie they developed the first one, the atom bomb, and then there have been developments since then, the hydrogen bomb. And the hydrogen bomb, I forget the name of it, that was dropped. They did a test in what it was, the 60s or 70s. Russia did this like the Tsar bomb or something like that. I can't remember the name of the bomb. Tsar Bomba. Yeah, and that one was like, what, the blast radius was like 10 miles or something like that, and it was just ridiculous. And obviously they were trying to showcase their power and their ability to make these bombs to kind of chill everyone else to the bone, which I think it achieved that. But anyways, this movie really got me thinking about the fact that these things just exist in the world, and then how should we actually think about that, morally, like going back to the events. Man, I suppose one other part of the movie that was just really well done, in my opinion. And sorry, Tyler, I'll pass it over to you quickly. One of the parts of the movie that was so well done was right after they dropped the bomb in Hiroshima, and then they went back, and like everyone was supposed to be celebrating, this event that occurred. And Oppenheimer's like getting up, and he like gives a speech, and he like starts to have what I think they're trying to portray, like a panic attack or something like that, or he's just like really, really conflicted. And I thought that they did that really well. Like they were showing scenes, of people like nauseous afterwards, after hearing the news of this and stuff. And it just seems like, yeah, I mean, if us being here in history, or where we are now, if we were back in that time when it happened, and we were cognizant and aware and everything, like it probably would have hit us a little bit differently than it does now. It's just like, this is something that previous generations did, but seeing that on camera, and the conflicted, like it had to have been a conflicting thing that happened. But anyways, yeah. I think that whole thing was just really well done.
It is. He's having a dissociative episode when he gives that speech. He feels pulled out of the immediate reality, and his other feelings are bleeding through in that. You just brought up something that I think may have made the movie land a bit differently for me than it did for you two, because you two guys are younger than I am, but I grew up in the Cold War. And so the threat of nuclear Armageddon was hanging over us every
Mm-hmm.
day. And so, we almost went to nuclear war several times in the 1980s. And of course, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis before that, but that was before I was born. But having grown up with a much more active threat of nuclear war, that is something we were seriously worried about all the time, that may have made the movie land a little bit a little differently for me than for you two.
So,
True.
so for me, am I coming through okay?
Yeah, you are.
Yeah.
Okay. So for me, I thought it was a brilliant movie, and the reason why I think people are saying it's the most important movie possibly of um, this century so far is because it brings this sort of awareness, and I hope, I pray that it will bring this back into popular discussion more, where people will be discussing whether or not um, we should have nuclear weapons, whether or not we should strive to decrease our nuclear arsenal, and what we can do to truly end nuclear occupation. The scene that y'all are talking about I thought was fantastic. It was almost like a horror movie, right? When he's kind of looking at everyone, and
Right.
there's this one part where all of a sudden you hear like this scream of like a young girl maybe, when he's kind of seeing everyone go into flames. I thought, I mean, camera wise, I thought this was just tremendous. A critique, um, to me, I thought that I wish it kind of would have shown more of the after effects of the nuclear weapon, or perhaps even showing the nuclear weapon, um, seeing the kind of devastation that it created. So there's a scene at the end where Oppenheimer, um, he cites all the deaths that have occurred immediately from the nuclear weapon, and then all those that have preceded, right, from the years after, and that sort of thing, developing poisoning and cancer and all that sort of thing. And he's giving all these statistics to show kind of how just devastating this all is, right? But I kind of want to almost like we Cameron and I reviewed Sound of Freedom a few weeks ago, and I think what made that such a powerful story was we got to see a case of like one little girl, right, and her brother, and it's kind of like we put a face to the statistics, so to speak, in
Mm-hmm.
reference to child trafficking. I wish we could have seen a face to kind of pair up what um, nuclear weapons look like, so to speak, in a personal way. Like maybe some sort of story that could have been followed, or I don't know, pictures, or I just felt like Japan wasn't well represented. Like it didn't have a voice, and I felt like it needed a voice. Other than that, though, I was totally cool with the 3 hours. I was fine with for 4 hours if it had another hour. I was totally down with it. I think all this sort of thing is all really interesting. But anyway, those are my initial thoughts. I did think it's a very important movie, solid A. Um, really appreciated how everything was done, and this movie should get a lot of Oscars, I imagine.
Yeah, I to piggyback off of that, I think that if he were to tell a story, I mean, part of I think why he didn't do that is because Christopher Nolan does not like to use special effects. He doesn't like to use CGI or anything like that. And so to create something of that scale, like a whole city being blown up, like it would take the practical effects. Maybe that's one reason why he didn't want to do that. I mean, you can use models, so I suppose they could have done something similar along those lines. Yeah, Jimmy.
I think he also didn't want to do it because if you have a parallel Japanese story that's going to be running, because what he's trying to do is present us with a realistic psychoportrait of Robert Oppenheimer. This is really a movie about Oppenheimer. It's not about the other people. In fact, there's lots of stuff buried in here that you recognize if you know the period. Like, for example, there's in meetings with scientists or at parties at Los Alamos, you'll see this one guy, younger guy, playing the bongos. And if you know your history of science in this period, it's like, oh, okay, that's Richard Feynman, who is a famous physicist. But he has, I don't think, any lines in the movie. He's just in there because he
Hmm.
was present. And similarly, other people
Bored.
like Teller they're there, and he has some. Edward Teller has some lines, but not a lot. But it's not his story. It's a psychoportrait of Oppenheimer himself. And if they created a parallel Japanese track, they would have to give it similar realism and moral complexity, because otherwise it would come across as just, here's our Japanese victim and they're unalloyed good, and there's no cross examination of Japan and the reasons why people in America thought it was reasonable to drop the bomb on it. And it would pull too much of the focus away from our central character. You'd have to create a 2-track movie, which I don't know if audiences would be up for 6 hours these days, but
Yeah.
it would create. I mean, The Blue Angel, I think, was 6 hours back in the days of silent film, but it would be a little long. It would pull the focus away from the complex, realistic portrait he's trying to paint of Oppenheimer, and so I think that's probably why he didn't want to go down that path.
Even if there wasn't a 2 track, right? Even if it was just kind of showing some footage, some real life footage, right, at the very end, showing kind of what it looked like, showing whaling, showing moms without their children and children without their moms. I don't know. I just felt like that voice could have been represented a bit more, and I think that it would have put even more power to the statistics. Um,
I recognize what you're saying as a legitimate option for a filmmaker. I suspect Nolan didn't want to do that because if you can't, he's trying to portray Oppenheimer and his associates in a realistic way as flawed people, not simply as good or bad. And he would feel the same need to do the same thing for any Japanese people he showed. So it wouldn't just be the voice of the victims he'd have to show. It would also be the voice of the Japanese warmongers saying, we need to do suicide bombs and suicide bombings, and we need to fight to the last man, and we need to attack America, because he'd have to show the same moral complexity for them that he does for Oppenheimer and the Americans in the movie, and the immigrants to America in the movie. And it's often, I've heard it said that that's one of the problems with the novel Grapes of Wrath, that the thing that keeps Grapes of Wrath from being the greatest American novel of all time is that you have this fascinating, complex portrait of the Joad family, who are our protagonists, and then the people up against them are just uniformly evil. And if you included only the voice of the Japanese victims on the Japanese side and didn't include the negative aspects that led to this on the Japanese side, then you'd have the reverse. You'd have this complex sort of set of bad guys against an unalloyed good. And that would disturb the realism that Nolan's trying to achieve in the movie. Also,
yeah,
he one of the things that Oppenheimer and others were struggling with was not having a Japanese perspective on things. And there was a lot of debate about, okay, so if we do a land invasion of Japan, what's going to happen? How bad is it really going to be? Are they going to resist to the last person? Are millions of Japanese people going to die, or will they give up quicker than that? And that was an issue they had to struggle with in their calculations of what to do with the bomb. And so I don't know that this was in Nolan's mind, but he could say, I wanted to show the cognitive limitations that Oppenheimer and the Americans were in not knowing exactly how the Japanese would react to different things, and yet they had to make this dramatic decision under those kind of cognitive limitations.
yeah, and I know Japan, and we're going to get into this later when we talk about the Doppler double effect. Um, and I know Japan sort of enlisted their citizens to be part of their army, so to speak. But there were clearly victims who were innocent. The
Yep.
children, thinking, even some men, lots of women who um, were just generally victims of their government and victims of a nuclear bomb. And I guess to me, it would be okay to hear their voice without having to hear anything else, because they are just innocent in this regard. They're victims of both their government and of the U.S. nuclear weapon. Anyway, so I guess that's from my side, kind of how I'd see that. Real quick, I just want to give a heads up, because I'd feel negligent if I didn't mention this for anyone who's watching this and like, hey, I want to go watch the movie. Just real quick,
Oh,
there
I
are
know
two
what's coming.
sexual scenes, yes, and it caught me, by surprise. And just FYI, I think one of them was when Oppenheimer was first at a party, right? And he's with a girl, and the next scene, you'll see stuff. And so, and then there's a scene much later on during the dialogue and discussion regarding keeping his clearance, that sort of hearing, where there's a scene in the hearing where there's a projection of something going on. So just FYI for those who are sensitive to those things, those who plan to look away, as I did. Those would be the areas to do that.
Yeah, there's also a third scene where we have frontal nudity, and these are all brief scenes, but yeah, as soon as we hit the first one, I'm looking down. So this is not for kids.
Yeah, and I don't think some people in the comments are saying like even their unsaved friends were like they were just completely unnecessary. Like we didn't need to see, they didn't need to show anything during those scenes. It just didn't contribute to the story much at all. So it was an odd choice to include those. But perhaps we should go ahead and move on to discuss the accuracy of the movie. Mm-hmm. So how accurate was this story of Oppenheimer? And I suspect, now I haven't read all the articles and stuff that you guys have read on this particular aspect, but I suspect that it was pretty close. And then I also suspect that there's a lot of details that are included in the movie that were otherwise not really well known in the wider public sphere about Oppenheimer. And so this was, I think that was part of the reason why he wanted to do this, was to get as accurate as possible and to show that like there was a sort of political movement being made against him that was, illicit in one sense. And so to me, I think like in a movie setting, you've got to take some cinematic leeway, and you've got to like make some moves to make the story interesting. However, like in a case like this, where I think one of the explicit things that he wants to do is defend Oppenheimer, I don't know that he would want to stray too far away from the actual facts of the case. But yeah, let's go ahead and discuss this aspect of the movie.
That's like the one of the main areas that I've seen like conservatives complain about. Was it the third hour not only was unnecessary or boring, but it was communist propaganda, right? I've seen this sort of critique that it was trying to portray the government as overly cautious about communist influence and whether or not Oppenheimer was a communist, and it was trying to vindicate Oppenheimer in light of this over-ambitious witch hunt sort of for communists. And the critique was that there wasn't an accurate representation with respect to the threat of communist infiltration. It kind of made it seem like a boogeyman, like it's far out. It's there was sort of no presence to try to ground the facts about the environment, how there really was justification to be concerned about communist or USSR influence. This was actually something that needed to be looked at in great detail. Like there was reason to put Oppenheimer under the scope, so to speak, of cross-examination. Whether or not he should have been vindicated is another story. But just kind of to Jimmy's point a few minutes ago about victims of nuclear war having to bring the other side as well, it seemed possibly like it was a little too one-sided with respect to Oppenheimer in the third hour, and maybe not enough justification for why the other side, why he was cross-examined, why there really was a threat. If any of that makes sense.
Real quick,
I think
Jimmy, before you come in, your misspeaking about Oppenheimer made me think like they called him Oppie a number of times during the movie, and I could not get the image of Graham Oppie out of my head. Same. Every time they would say Oppie, I was like, that's the wrong Oppie, first of all. But yeah, no, it was funny. Yeah, Jimmy, go ahead.
So the movie is extremely accurate as far as movies go. It does take a few liberties, but nowhere near as much as most movies do. I saw someone say this movie is the most based on a book ever. And it really is tightly based on the events recorded in American Prometheus. And reportedly, Christopher Nolan was really obsessive about it being accurate. It's extremely accurate. There are even things that, if you know the history, you recognize, but they don't dwell on it. Like, for example, fairly early on in the movie, there's a scene where Oppenheimer's walking down the street. He's in California, and he sees this guy run out of a barber shop. And the guy, I want to say his name is Luis Alvarado. He was one of Oppenheimer's associates and students who was a physicist. This is an actual moment from real history where Luis Alvarado was having his haircut, and he reads in the newspaper about the first sustained fission reaction and how much energy it produced. And he told the barber to stop cutting his hair, and he leapt up and he ran. This is like at Stanford. And he ran across to the radiation lab and started announcing the news that this has just happened. And Oppenheimer showed up. And Oppenheimer initially, just like in the movie, was dismissive of saying, this is not possible. The energies won't work. And then they ran a test and showed him, look at this oscilloscope, look at what it's showing us. And Oppenheimer pivoted and within a few minutes had deduced the possibility of the atomic bomb. And this all really happened, including the leaping up from the chair in the barber's office or in the barber's shop. They didn't have to do it that way, but that's a real event that if you know about the history, it's like you instantly recognized, oh, this is the barbershop moment. So on a very small level of detail, Nolan was trying to be extremely accurate. In terms, Tyler, of the concern that you mentioned that some have raised about, is it accurately showing us, the threat of communism in the period? I would say I think it is similar to the Where Are the Voices of the Victims of Japan thing, because Oppenheimer did live in the McCarthy era. Right. And the McCarthy era was a real thing that had impacts on people's lives, not all of which were fair. McCarthy was a demagogue. Now, it's true, communists were a real threat. They did have spies in America. Some of their spies were able to infiltrate into sensitive positions.
Even in the Manhattan Project.
Even into the Manhattan Project, and they name one of the people who was a communist spy in the Manhattan Project. What they don't do is name all of the others that have since come to light that were connected with the Manhattan Project. Because, again, what Nolan is trying to do is focus on Oppenheimer. What did Oppenheimer know? What effect did these events have on him? He's not trying to tell a broader story about the ethics of World War II in Japan or the ethics of rooting out communists or anything. He's just focused on this one guy. It's a biopic of him. And it would have taken him too far away from his central figure to have an extended, digression about, oh, and by the way, there was a big communist threat. And that provides context for this. Oppenheimer didn't have all the evidence about the broader threat. He just knew I'm being targeted now because of decisions and people I'm connected with. And so I think that's why Nolan stays focused on him. And I don't really mind the we're not ringing the alarm bell about the real threat of communism in the McCarthy era any more than I mind the we're not ringing the alarm bell about the victims in Japan. Because what he's trying to do is tell us the story of this one guy. By the
Right.
way, one thing that is not commonly known about the espionage in connection with the Trinity test and the Manhattan Project is there are the Russians actually hired a couple of guys in addition to having people in the project itself, and there was like at least 4 or 5. But in addition to having people in the project itself who were telling the Russians how the project was developing, they also had people follow up on the Trinity test of the first nuclear bomb test in New Mexico, where they hired a couple of guys from Mexico who didn't really speak English to come up and witness it. They didn't know what they were going to see. And they were told, collect the dirt afterwards and put it in your pockets and bring it back to us in Mexico. So you have these 2 guys who don't really know what's going on, and they're there at the Trinity test. They collect dirt, they put it in their pockets, they go back to Mexico, they meet with their Soviet handlers. The Soviet handlers collect the dust, and then they take blood from the 2 guys. They take blood samples from them so they can look at what the radiation did to their blood. And they were using these guys as human dosimeters, which are devices meant to measure the amount of radiation someone's exposed to. They were actually using innocent Mexican people as human dosimeters to get data on the Trinity test, which is just another sign of how much espionage there was connected with this project and this test. But they don't go into that in the movie because Oppenheimer and his associates didn't know about that at the time.
Right. So I guess this brings to the larger point about both these issues, right? Which is, it does seem to me that the film is trying to, at least in part, make us more sympathetic to Oppenheimer.
Mhm.
And I think Cameron mentioned maybe even this is intentional, explicit by Nolan in reference to kind of vindicating Oppenheimer or defying him or making him less morally, his responsibility being mitigated to some degree. I know that maybe I misunderstood Cameron. Maybe that's not what he said. But
I do think that Nolan was wanting to. I think he was. I could have been misinterpreting him. I was listening to an interview that he did, and he said something like, "This story needs to be told," and so maybe he was just referring to the book that Jimmy was referring to, and he was just saying that story needs to be told. Yeah. So I could be misinterpreting him here.
Yeah. It seemed like an apologetic, though, for mitigated responsibility for Oppenheimer.
It did.
And if so, then it does seem relevant to hear from the various victims, or to hear, say, from the sort of ultimately, right, the government was kind of justified in being concerned with espionage regarding the Manhattan Project and broader implications of that. Those do seem relevant to, if indeed, and perhaps Nolan's not trying to do this, if indeed this isn't an apologetic to mitigate the moral responsibility of Oppenheimer, that's one thing. But if it is, then it does seem like all these things are relevant.
I don't think it is an apologetic for Oppenheimer. I didn't get that Nolan was trying to defend Oppenheimer. These days, most people have no idea who Oppenheimer was. They may have heard that he's the father of the atomic bomb, but they really haven't. They don't know anything about his losing his security clearance. They don't know anything about the decisions and the process he went through in directing the Manhattan Project. Most people have no clue who he is. And so I didn't view this movie as an attempt to rehabilitate him, because he doesn't have a bad reputation these days, or an attempt to defend him against critics, because he doesn't really have any mainstream critics these days. I viewed this as an attempt to portray a realistic picture of who this important historical figure was and to educate people about him in a balanced way. And that's why Nolan shows his flaws. He commits adultery. He's a terrible father, and he is torn by he's trying to be conscientious, and so he's like, I'm just a scientist, I'm helping build this device, but it's not our responsibility as scientists to say how this should be used. We don't have special wisdom as scientists. We need to leave that to the political decision makers because that's what their job is. And on the other hand, he feels incredibly guilty about what happened, and he even gives towards the end of the movie, he and Einstein are having a discussion by a pond, and he tells Einstein, I think we've just set in motion the destruction of the world. That's not the kind of line you'd put on his lips if this is just an apologetic for him or a defense of him.
Well, it could be.
It's a psychological portrait of how torn he feels by what he's done.
But it's in seeing how torn he is, and in seeing, those lines. It seems like he kind of goes back and forth. He's like, well, I mean, they're going to use the bomb anyway. Might as well just get this over with. So everyone can see how horrible this is of an idea, and then we'll stop doing this, right? And then he sees that actually it just kind of triggers the opposite reaction, and everyone's like, oh, this is so powerful! Wow, we need many more of these. And then he sees like, oh, I didn't anticipate this, right? So it seems like all that's kind of part of making us more sympathetic to him, and making us kind of see his responsibility as mitigated. But you might be right, Jimmy. I'm not an expert on Nolan's intentions, or I haven't read a lot from Nolan on kind of his aims for the movie. So you might be right. This might not supposed to be an attempt to mitigate some of the responsibility. But if it's taken as such, then it does seem right to kind of maybe show a little bit more from other voices, so to speak. But maybe you can tell me this. I did hear, in reference to being historically accurate, I read a bit on it, and yes, like it seems like exactly what you were saying. Seems very, very much so, quite accurate. The one scene that the grandson of Oppenheimer, I don't know if you saw this, but he objected actually to the apple and cyanide scene.
Oh, thank you. I was going to mention
I wasn't
that.
sure how well. Yeah, how well grounded is that, Jimmy? How well?
So one of the things that'll surprise you if in watching the movie is within the first 5 minutes, we have this scene of Oppenheimer at university in England, and his professor is kind of punishing him a little bit for doing sloppy lab work. And that's accurate. Oppenheimer was not, there are sort of two kinds of physicists, theoretical physicists and experimental physicists. And Oppenheimer was very much a theoretical physicist. He was not a good experimentalist, and especially early on. And they showed him being bad at experimental physics in class when he's at university. And his professor is like, okay, let's all go listen to this lecture by Niels Bohr, except for you, Oppenheimer. Stay here and do your lab work. And he gets mad at his professor for leaving him behind. And his professor has apples that he's been eating. And Oppenheimer sees he's left one behind on his desk. And Oppenheimer, because they're in a physics lab, they've got chemicals on shelves. He goes to, and this is all in the first 5 minutes or so of the movie, Oppenheimer goes to a shelf, gets a bottle of potassium cyanide, which is a poison. This is what cyanide is. It's potassium cyanide. And he uses a syringe to draw out some of the cyanide and inject it into the apple and leave it back on the teacher's desk. And then he goes to the lecture by Niels Bohr, and he asks a question of Niels Bohr. And then in the middle of the night, he has a crisis of conscience. He realizes what he's done. He's just attempted murder. And the next morning, he runs down to the lab to get that apple before the professor can eat it. And Niels Bohr is there chatting with the professor. And Niels Bohr is holding the apple and about to take a bite out of it. And so Oppenheimer has to make conversation with Niels Bohr and the professor and get that apple out of Niels Bohr's hand before he takes a bite, because he'll die from the cyanide. And Just as Bohr is about to take a bite of it, Oppenheimer slaps it out of his hand into the trash can and says, "Oh, wormhole." Back in the original meaning of the word wormhole, a hole has been made in this apple by a worm. So there's not the modern physics meaning of wormhole. And so there's a question of how accurate is this? Well, it turns out that there's a big element of truth here, but a slight level of artistic license. Oppenheimer did try to poison an apple for his professor. That's true. And in later years, he said he wasn't even that sure why he did it. But the thing that is a little bit of and the apple ended up not getting eaten. Apparently, slapping it out of Niels Bohr's hand, that's some artistic license, as is the potassium cyanide. It is widely thought that what he actually poisoned the apple with was something to make his teacher sick, not to, like, I don't know, that they would have botulism toxin, but, something like that would make you sick, but not kill you. So they've escalated it a little bit from what we can show historically, but the core of the story, he did try to poison his teacher's apple. That was true.
The core of the story, Jimmy?
The apple core of the story. Notice,
Well,
and I appreciate the double entendre on core in connection with nuclear technology. Yeah,
that's right.
Well, while we're discussing, we're still on just the second thing that we want to discuss in this interview, so maybe we'll go a little bit quicker here. But number two is just how accurate the movie is, and then we're about to, in just a little bit, we're going to move to the moral issues that the movie involved. So, but before we do that, while we're talking about the accuracy of the movie, so as I mentioned earlier, Nolan likes to use practical effects for his movies. So he likes to avoid CGI as much as possible. So we actually have a colorized version of the Trinity test. And we found this, Jimmy actually found this in really high resolution. So we're going to play this. There's no audio or anything, so we're just going to watch what it looks like together. And it's going to be pretty ominous. But this is, like, if you saw the movie, we don't have pictures or anything of what it looked like in the movie. I was actually a little bit underwhelmed at what it looked like, the explosion. It looked like they just got like a little M60 and like blew it off and then zoomed in on it, something like that. It was a very underwhelming, like there was no mushroom cloud or anything like that. They didn't have any, it just didn't look that impressive. But this is apparently actual footage from the Trinity test. And as I say, it's been colorized, so it looks a little bit weird. But let's go ahead and watch this. Well, I guess I can go ahead and read what it's showing here on the screen for anyone who's listening instead of watching. But you may want to, if you are just listening, you may want to turn your phone on and start watching. So, but it says in the early hours of July 16, 1945, the first ever atomic bomb was detonated in the New Mexico desert, ushering in the nuclear age. The explosion released an astonishing amount of energy equivalent to 25 kilotons of TNT. The success of the Trinity test meant that the United States would be able to use atomic weapons in warfare, which they did twice less than a month later. So here's what it looks like. This clip is about 2 minutes long, so we'll just watch it and kind of be in awe of it. I mean, that alone, like this alone, like part of me is like, I wish Nolan would have used some special effects here, because that is just
or he
crazy.
Could have used the actual footage we have and just colorized it like this.
But it's incredible. Let me actually back up and let's watch that explosion one more time.
Yeah, that's intense.
Yeah, and that's what dropped on Hiroshima. I think was the Trinity. Remind me what. Yeah, was the Trinity test? Was it stronger or weaker than the one that they dropped on Hiroshima?
I believe it was stronger because there were two different types of bombs that were used with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and there are two different fundamental designs of atomic bombs. Setting aside hydrogen bombs is a different thing.
Right.
There are two major types of fission bombs. One is what's sometimes called a gun model bomb, where you have two masses of fissile material, uranium-235 in this case, and you slam one of them into the other, and in the microsecond where the two of them make contact, it becomes the mass goes critical, and you have this explosion, and that's called a gun model bomb because you're firing one mass into the other like a bullet. And that's what they dropped on Hiroshima, and they didn't even bother testing it first because they knew this is going to work. They knew what critical mass was for uranium-235. They were very confident it was going to work. What they were less confident of was the other model of atomic bomb, which is known as an implosion model bomb, where you have a sphere of explosives that explode inward and force fissile material together to cause the explosion. And that's what they weren't sure was going to work. So that's what they tested at Trinity. They tested, will an implosion model bomb work? And they found out it did. And then they dropped an implosion bomb on Nagasaki, on the second city that was bombed. So they used gun model for Hiroshima and implosion model for Nagasaki.
Well, in terms of accuracy,
yield, the implosion model is going to be stronger than the gun model is, at least typically, because you can't make the two components of a gun model super big without them going critical themselves. You have to keep them under the critical threshold.
The point that I wanted to kind of highlight, though, with this clip, though, is that the practical effects that they used was just not very accurate to the tests. It didn't see, like they had some scenes where everyone was kind of like laying down, facing away from the explosion, had some like black card that they put in front of their eyes so that they wouldn't look directly into the blast and stuff. So, you know what? Actually, one of the scenes that I was really expecting it to be rated R for this scene was when that guy was in the car. I don't remember who it was, but he was sitting in the car, and they were like, you know, are you gonna like shield yourself? What are you gonna do? And he was like, well, I'll just, you know, I don't need any glasses. I'm in the car. And then someone said, well, what are you gonna do when the windshield like explodes? You know? And he's like, oh, I'll be fine or whatever. And then I was expecting that guy to get like destroyed, but nothing ended up happening. So
yeah, fortunately they were outside of the blast radius. What I was surprised, and I was really hoping they were going to show in that scene that they didn't, is a phenomenon that has been reported at various nuclear tests where even with like smoked glass or, you know, goggles to keep the glare from burning out your retinas, even wearing protective eyewear, people would look at their hands covered in, you know, sometimes like covered in fabric. They'd have long shirt sleeves and such. And when the bomb went off and the light and radiation flash happened, people could see their bones.
Wow.
And because there's so much light and so much radiation and stuff coming off of it that it turned you into a living X-ray. And I was really hoping they were going to do that. It's like I wanted to see that visualized on screen, but they didn't do that.
Yeah. Not accurate. Nolan, you had an opportunity to create one of the coolest scenes ever, and you didn't do it. Okay, well, why don't we move on to the third thing that we wanted to discuss, which is probably the main thing, is the moral issues that are involved with this movie.
And here, Tyler and I will agree.
Yeah. I think we're all going to agree on this. So basically, questions like, you know, was the atomic bomb morally justified when we dropped it on Hiroshima? And then when can you actually use nuclear weapons? Can you ever use nuclear weapons? These sorts of questions, you know, this is what I think the movie is trying to get us to think about. And there was one point in the movie, one of the quotes that I remember distinctly, there was the quote at the very end of the movie was also really powerful. I just can't remember. I don't remember the phrasing of it, so I'm not going to try to repeat it. But at one point earlier on in the movie, there was a scientist that Oppenheimer was working with. Don't remember his name, but he asked him to be part of the project. And he was like, you know, well, what do you think? Like, do you want to be part of this? And he was like, well, no, I can't be part of it because bombs get dropped on the just and the unjust. And so that was his reasoning, you know, that was his sort of ethical framework for why he's not going to be involved in this project. And so, yeah, just so many interesting moral and ethical questions get brought up here. But Tyler, let's start with you. How should we start to really think clearly about the ethical stuff that gets raised in this movie?
Right. First, I just want to say I don't even necessarily disagree, Jimmy, with you on your responses to my criticisms of the film. I was just saying, if I was making a lot of conditional claims, like if that was the case, then it does seem like this. Again, I'm no expert in Nolan's intentions or or the biography that it's based off of its intentions. So I will succumb to your critiques and responses by far. So not even we disagree there. We agree, I think, on most things. Here, right. So there's something called doctrine and double effect, which is utilized in ethics. Whenever you have basically no easy solution, right? You have in front of you a problem, and it seems like if you do phi, something bad will happen. If you do not phi, something bad will happen. So the doctrine of double effect helps see what moral action should we take. What truly is the sort of morally justified response that we should make. It helps us make these sorts of decisions. And you can get doctrine of double effect, different kind of models in the literature. I'm going to use kind of just like a basic standard model for our own case here. I don't need to get into the nitty gritty or why certain models seem better than others. But here's one general approach, right? The idea first is that, like I mentioned earlier, it has to be such that basically you're using the doctrine double effect when there are no, sort of good or easy alternatives. And the idea is that you can't do something that's intrinsically wrong, right? Never justifiable, right? It's always going to be impermissible, right? So it's not like you can do something horrible, like I'm going to murder someone to save 1 million people. The doctrine of double effect would never justify that. The action that you take has to be minimally moral neutral, if not morally good. So it's not just like this utilitarian principle where it's like, well, whatever brings about the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people, right? So yeah, if torturing this individual will save 1 million lives, then torture the person to death. It's not going to endorse that, right? So the action can't in itself be intrinsically wrong. The bad stuff that comes about from your action is sort of a byproduct. Is a byproduct is a result of the action that you take. So that's going to be important. And the idea is that ultimately, from the action that you take, there can't be overall sort of more bad that comes than good. Right? It has to, at best, the sort of results need to be morally neutral or stagnant, or there needs to be more good that overall comes. Right? So, oftentimes the doctrine of double effect gets brought up when we're talking about prenatal humans. Like, what about the very, very, very minimal amount of cases that exist or have existed when a woman is her life is genuinely at stake, such that both her and the child will die? Can we do some sort of procedure that doesn't directly disembody or directly kill the prenatal human, right, the child? But nonetheless, this procedure will save the mother's life. But as a result of the procedure, as a byproduct, right, the child will unfortunately perish. So, sometimes you might think, well, okay, maybe these procedures are morally neutral, but nonetheless, they're going to have this bad side effect. The intention that's relevant isn't to kill the child. It's simply to save the mother's life. And so given that the intention isn't to kill the child, given that the action that's taken isn't to directly dismember the child, but it's sort of just as a result of this sort of medical procedure that the child ends up dying, and given that there's good that comes out of this, more good than bad, namely that at least the mother survives, in cases where if you didn't do this procedure, the mother and child would both die. Okay. Now, whether or not you think these sorts of scenarios are come about or whether or not you think that these scenarios are sort of made up from the abortion lobby. I don't care to get into that sort of debate right now, but you can imagine this sort of scenario here, theoretically at least. This is how you might apply the doctrine of double effect to kind of an everyday occurrence here. And so we can apply this to nuclear weapons, dropping nuclear weapons, right, on cities where there's hundreds of thousands, millions of people. It seems like that's an intrinsic evil, right? To drop a nuclear weapon wholesale on innocent civilians. That's kind of like murdering or torturing someone, which torturing is an intrinsic evil. Murdering or torturing someone in order to, bring about more happiness or more pleasure.
Maybe we don't want to. Maybe we don't want to be as dogmatic about torture because that has a problematic definition, and some forms of pain infliction are not intrinsically immoral. But go ahead, please.
Yeah. So in this case, it would be, as I said, well, at least Jimmy and I can agree on that murdering someone to bring about a greater good, so to speak, it's intrinsically wrong. You can't use the doctrine of double effect to justify saving a million people by murdering this individual because the action itself is not morally neutral or morally good. It's a necessary condition for the doctrine of double effect to take place. Now, some people, some critics, even in sort of circles that I run in, have argued, well, maybe because the Japanese government made it such that all children, women, and men were part of the military, right, and should be seen as part of the military to combat the American troops. So then that way we can kind of see that the it's not an intrinsic evil because we're not dropping a bomb on thousands of innocent people, right? But we're dropping a bomb on enemy combatants, so to speak. Even if they appear to be children and women, really, Japan is using them and has declared that they are part of the infantry, so to speak. So maybe it's not an intrinsically evil act since they're all part of the enemy combatants. And it's okay to bomb enemy combatants, so it's okay to bomb these cities like this. But I find that very implausible, right? To think that like a 3-year-old, right, sucking her thumb is an enemy combatant. I mean, just because the state declares by fiat that that's the case, I don't think that there's actually some truth to the matter of that. That seems to me to be not a good strategy to use. I don't know, Jimmy, your thoughts?
Yeah, so just to recap briefly what the law of double effect is a principle that gets used in moral theology and in philosophy that says if an action has two effects, one of which is a good effect and one of which is a bad effect, that's why it's called the law of double effect, because this action has these two effects, one good and one bad. You can perform the action knowing that it's going to produce both effects on certain conditions. The first condition is that the bad effect is not your goal. The second condition is the bad effect is not a means to accomplishing your goal. And the third condition is that that the good effect is proportionate to the bad effect, meaning it's at least equal or greater than the bad effect. So if we apply that to the case of nuclear weapons, now I actually think there are situations in which you could use nuclear weapons, and we can talk about that. But I don't think you can use them in this situation because part of the intention of dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki was killing civilians. There were debates at the time, and they even allude to this in the movie. Some scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project thought, okay, now that we've got this bomb, we don't need to actually use it on Japan. We could blow up an island somewhere to show them how powerful it is and convince them that way. But it was argued, no, if we don't drop it on Japan, then the message won't get through. They'll be able to dismiss it because they won't be eyewitnesses of it. They'll just be hearing reports about the Americans blew up some island. So, okay, well then, if we are going to drop it on Japan, we could drop it on a military target that's not in the middle of a city. And that way we would be using it for a legitimate purpose, destroying a military target, but we would be trying to minimize civilian casualties. This is the same principle as if, let's say, you're a bomber in World War II, you have conventional bombs, but you're going to blow up a German munitions factory. Well, you can do that even knowing there's an innocent night watchman in that munitions factory, because the good effect of this action is destroying the factory. The goal is not to kill the night watchman. Neither are you killing the night watchman as a means to accomplishing your goal. The death of the night watchman is a side effect of what you're actually doing. And the ending a Nazi munitions factory is proportionate to the death of one innocent person. So you could use conventional bombs to destroy a military target and tolerate the death of at least some innocents, knowing that it is neither a means nor an end. The death of those innocents is neither your means nor your end. You're not trying to kill them. And if they survive, that's great. You're not using their deaths to accomplish your goal. So the same thing could be true in bombing Japan with a nuke. You could go after a military target that is away from civilian centers, maybe one of their aircraft carriers or something. And as long as you're not trying to kill civilians, and as long as you're not using their deaths as a means to your end, you could drop a nuke. But in this case, if you go back, and I've actually done this, if you read the declassified minutes of the meetings where they were talking about target selection, it's very clear they wanted to hit a major city. And the reason they wanted to hit a major city would so that there would be massive civilian deaths. Now, they didn't want to kill these people just to kill them. That wasn't their end. That wasn't their goal. Their goal was to get the Japanese government to surrender. But the death of many, many, many civilians was meant to inflict terror on the civilian government, that we would keep doing this and kill vast numbers of their civilians if they didn't surrender. And so that infliction of terror on the civilian government by means of killing all these civilians in major population centers, that was the means. And so the law of double effect is not satisfied, because you're using the death of innocent civilians as the means to accomplishing your goal of getting them to surrender. And that makes this, since terror was what was being inflicted on them, that makes the dropping of these two nukes an act of terrorism, because you're using terror to accomplish your political military goal of getting a surrender. So I would agree, because they were trying to cause mass civilian casualties, this was not justified. What about the argument you mentioned, Tyler, that, well, they were saying we're going to fight to the last man, woman, and child? Well, okay, that argument would work if these were Borg, because Borg are all aggressors. So, or if they were early stage Cylons, that would work, because every single one of them is a combatant. So you could nuke Borg or Cylons in this situation, but not humans. You have to wait. You can't just rely on someone might become an aggressor in the future, especially because humans have free will. You have to wait till they are an aggressor. So you can't kill baby Hitler just because he's going to be an aggressor one day. You have to wait for him to choose to be an aggressor, and then you can kill him. And in the same way, you can't anticipate, all these 5-year-old children are going to be aggressors one day, I'll just kill them now. You can't do that. You have to wait till they become an aggressor, And so you can't anticipate what they may do in the future, because the Japanese people are humans, they have free will, and you might be able to achieve your goal shy of doing that. And so I would say that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not fulfill the law of double effect, because they deliberately picked major population centers to use the death of civilians to inflict terror on the civilian government to compel them to surrender.
Right. So it was an intrinsically evil action to use these people, right, to murder them in order to achieve their terrorist means, um, their terroristic goal, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say, for example, that
Wait, so let me
go
just
ahead.
to get some clarification from you guys on this. So, are you saying, Jimmy, that the United States engaged in terrorism?
And it worked. They surrendered. Yeah, I'm saying the United States committed two acts of terrorism in this case, and it was actually more than that, because firebombing other cities, even with conventional weapons, had the same effect.
Well, so what about the person who would say in response to that, well, this was it brought about this great effect. What other means would you have used in order to bring about this good effect? There were no other means that were available to us at the time.
Okay, so that's not true. There were other means available. I've already mentioned two: attacking a military target that is not in a civilian center,
With a nuke.
and with a nuke, or blowing up an island as a demonstration of what we can do now, or conducting a ground invasion.
Right.
Or changing our demands. One of the things now in Japan.
Well, so wouldn't a ground? So sorry to cut you off, but wouldn't a ground invasion have resulted in more casualties, more American casualties than
Maybe,
just
but
dropping a bomb on an island like you suggested, or on a military base or something like that?
But at the end of the day, the ground
it might
invasion is not
have.
intrinsically evil.
Yeah, that's true. The ground invasion is not intrinsically evil. Also, to illustrate that, and then I have another point I want to make. But to illustrate that, I mean, suppose I've got a gang of 5 guys. We're a posse, let's say, in the Old West, and there's a gang of 5 outlaws holed up in a shack. Okay, and it's our job as the posse to bring these 5 guys to justice. So it's 5 against 5. Well, if we attack them and there's 5 of us and 5 of them, a bunch of us on both sides may get killed. So could I, in that situation, say, a simpler alternative that would spare more lives would be, I'll just kill the child of the head outlaw, who's an innocent. Let's say he's got a little 2-year-old daughter. I'll just kill his 2-year-old daughter as a way of compelling him to surrender, and threaten to kill all his other children if he doesn't surrender. Okay, that would be murder. That would be intrinsically wrong. I cannot take the life of a 2-year-old girl in order to compel her father to surrender. And that's essentially what happened in this case. So even if it would have resulted in more deaths, sometimes you have to accept the deaths, because it is not morally permissible to undertake this action. So that was one point I was going to make. The other point I wanted to make was we could have changed our demands. Now, George Weigel, who's a Catholic intellectual who actually supports the dropping of the bomb, I read an article by him where he goes through different options. And one of the things he points out is the reason that the Japanese people were being so adamant in their defense of the country was in substantial measure because of what we were demanding of them. We were demanding unconditional surrender. Now, that meant there was no guarantee of what was going to happen to their government and their emperor. We could have put the emperor on trial, Emperor Hirohito. We could have put him on trial for war crimes and executed him. And we could have abolished the monarchy. And we could have, we could have done anything to Japan in the wake of an unconditional surrender. So there was intense concern about, if we unconditionally surrendered to the Americans, what are the Americans going to do? Are they going to destroy our government and our emperor, who at the time was regarded as a semi-divine being, even though the emperor himself didn't believe that? What are they going to do to all of our sacred institutions if we unconditionally surrender? And that was what motivated things like kamikaze attacks and similar Japanese suicides during the island hopping campaign that was being conducted approaching the mainland. Well, if we had just changed our demands to we want to negotiate a peace now, or we want a peace and reparations, or we want something less than unconditional surrender, they might have been much more amenable. In fact, as Weigel points out, that was the goal of the suicide attacks, like the kamikaze planes. They knew they couldn't win the war at this point. That had been sealed actually pretty early in the war after we decimated them at the Battle of Midway. They knew they couldn't win. So the goal of the suicide attacks was to cause so many American casualties that we would be willing to negotiate a peace instead of demanding unconditional surrender. So we could have changed our war goals. We could have said, okay, we want to negotiate now, or we'll guarantee we'll leave your emperor in place and your government in place, but we want this war to stop. If we had demanded less, then they wouldn't have been doing the suicide attacks, and the war would have ended quicker. So the idea that dropping the bomb was the only option we had is simply false. There were multiple other options that did not involve intrinsically evil acts.
Yeah, and this gets to the point that's kind of alluded to in the movie, right? That how much of this was kind of more for the USSR than it was for our situation in Japan, especially by the time you get to the second nuclear weapon. This is a message to the USSR more than it is we have to do this or else we'll lose World War II or anything like that.
Yeah, there's even a nice moment where they explain the logic behind why two bombs, because they, in the target briefing scene, they say we need to do this at least twice. One, to show them it's possible, and two, to show them that we will keep doing it unless they surrender. So they viewed, at least one viewpoint was, we need to drop at least two bombs to accomplish what we need to accomplish here.
Until they surrender.
Yeah. And also show the Soviets, what we can do too, and that we can do it more than once.
Yeah. Okay. But you said earlier, Jimmy, that there are circumstances when, you think that a nuke could be used. Was that under the conditions, like you said, maybe bombing an island, maybe bombing a military base? Or were there other conditions?
No, there are others as well. There are others as well. Now, I used the Borg and Cylons as a science fiction example, but I could imagine real world scenarios. For example, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001, we had Osama bin Laden holed up in the mountains of Afghanistan, and he was an extremely high value target. And he's not in a population center. He wasn't living in Abbottabad at the time. We had intelligence that he's like in the Khyber Pass or something. So I think it could have been morally justified to, if we had hard intelligence on he's in this valley, we could drop a small tactical nuke on a remote valley to take out a high value target like Osama bin Laden and his lieutenants, and tolerate some civilian casualties. But that would be just like dropping a bomb on a Nazi munitions factory, knowing the night watchman is going to die. Yes, there will be civilian deaths, but those civilian deaths can be tolerated because they are neither the goal of the action nor the means to getting to the goal, and they're counterbalanced by a sufficiently high value military target. So I think you could, if you knew roughly where Osama bin Laden was in the wilds of, Afghanistan, you could have used like a tactical nuke to go after him, and it could be morally legitimate, assuming your intelligence is hard enough.
Right. Going back to your example, it would be the difference between the group of 5 people, say they're your enemies, and killing one of their children
Mhm.
in order to get them to surrender, right? That's an intrinsically evil action. You can never justify killing a child like that. Um, or dropping a bomb on these five bad guys, uh, not trying to kill any children, but knowing it's
There's a
remotely possible
risk.
that
Yeah.
there's some kids around. Those are two morally distinct categories I think
Mhm.
that we need.
Hmm. Okay, so one other question before we move on to the last three topics that we wanted to cover today, and those should go pretty quickly. But
Oh,
I
by the
was
way, let me just mention that even though I think there are situations where using nukes would be morally legitimate in principle, I'm not advocating we use them because we would be setting a dangerous precedent, and that could have what the British call knock-on effects that might be worse. And so I'm
hmm,
glad that I wish the two hadn't been used in Japan. I'm glad that no more have been used since then, because the more we use, the easier it becomes to use them.
yeah,
Yep. You normalize it.
yeah. Well, okay, so I was just thinking with respect to war more generally, and like this kind of like proactive violence that you're engaged in. Okay, so when you're in a military, like someone attacks you and you defend yourself. Self-defense is a very obvious like you can get violent in that situation. There's nothing morally blameworthy about that situation. Someone is in the process or about to attack you, you're able to defend yourself. Okay, that to me makes perfect sense. But suppose that you had intel that this person was planning to attack you, say that evening, and you got that intel that morning, and you decided to go out that morning and beat the guy up so that he wouldn't come and attack you that evening, right?
Mhm.
Would that's almost, it seems like what's kind of going on with these sorts of situations where we're proactively going out, bombing people, enacting violence in this way. Would you help me think about this more clearly? Help me
So,
like what
so
what
let's.
what could justify being proactive in being
Mhm.
violent in that way?
So I think the relevant distinction is the person an aggressor?
Mhm.
Meaning, have they made decisions that, and they could be mentally ill. These don't have to be full free will decisions, but they're an aggressor if they have made decisions to attack. And before they make that decision, you cannot be proactive. You cannot kill baby Hitler because baby
Mm-hmm.
Hitler has not made a decision to attack. But suppose that someone has made a decision and has not yet attacked. Well, you could potentially. You don't have to wait to get socked in the nose before you can defend yourself. If, let's say, Tyler and I are bitter enemies, and I see Tyler is about to swing at my face, I could pop him in the nose first. I could preemptively defend myself because he's
Mm-hmm.
already made the decision to attack. He's already an aggressor. I just have good intelligence, and so I can act before he strikes. That would be morally legitimate.
Please don't.
Also, I
It's been
won't.
broke twice.
Purely hypothetical. But and then
He's gonna
if
take
let's
you down,
say
Tyler, when we all meet up in person.
or let's say Tyler has done a surprise attack on me, like 9/11 was. So Tyler's socked me in the nose. I didn't know it was coming, and he's declared himself an aggressor thereby. I don't have to wait for him to hit again. I can go
Mm-hmm.
after him based on the sock he's already given me. So I think the relevant distinction morally is between, has the person decided to attack or not? If they have not decided to attack, you cannot attack them. If they have decided to attack, you don't have to wait for them to strike or strike again. You can go after them at that point morally.
Right. And that's the difference, is that in Japan with those children and women, right? They clearly, even though the government said they're going to be combatants, they were not, making, they weren't prepping, they
They
weren't,
weren't aggressors.
Yeah, if a 5-year-old isn't actually, like responsible for any of this, wasn't actually going to be an aggressor. So anyway, I think this just simply
Also,
doesn't.
5-year-olds are terrible fighters compared to
Right,
American GIs.
right.
All right, so we're going to talk about now. We're going to move on to discuss some other aspects of the movie. One of them is, so whatever happened to Oppenheimer, like after the movie, historically, did he ever sort of recover? And I think we're going to turn to Jimmy for this.
Yeah,
He
real quick.
loses his security. Yeah, go ahead.
As we finish up, I just want to say, I think ultimately this is, um, it relates to ultimately, can we do evil for evil, right? I think it's the Sermon on the Mount, right? Can we,
Mhm.
do we respond with evil do we respond to evil with evil, or do we respond evil with good? And so that's why I think it's really important that we're not doing intrinsically evil actions in order to respond to evil.
Mm.
And so this is even if you don't want to talk about natural law or whatever, this is partly based on this is partly based on scripture, right? This is based on the Sermon on the Mount, that we're called to be Christians, we're called to be salt and light. And so even if it causes more casualties, we have to do the right action rather than what the actions do, those of the pagans.
So
Yeah, that's
there's
good. I was actually going to ask, and Jimmy, I'll let you come back in before we move on to the next section. I was going to ask, and I meant to ask, how does Christianity tie into this whole conversation? So that was a beautiful way to do that.
And I want to throw in just an additional thought regarding the Sermon on the Mount, because some people might say, well, but in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, if your enemy strikes your right cheek, offer him your left. And that seems contrary to the self-defense ethic you've just been advocating. And it's true, but one of the things that people have to realize about the Sermon on the Mount is Jesus is not giving us a treatise on moral theology. He's giving us multiple important points that have to be understood in harmony with each other. That's why in the first chapter, in Matthew 5, in the first chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, he says, do your good deeds in secret. And then he turns around and says, let your light shine before men. And what that means is, well, sometimes it's appropriate to do one and sometimes it's appropriate to do the other. In the same way, don't insist on your rights. Don't defend yourself is the appropriate thing to do in some circumstances. But in other circumstances, defending yourself or others, like your family, who you are charged by natural law with defending, is also the right thing to do, as illustrated by other passages in the New Testament, and certainly in the Old Testament. So what you can't do is take a single passage and treat it as if it's the absolute that can be read in isolation from the rest of what Scripture says. So yes, there are situations where you literally turn the other cheek, but that's not all situations, and other passages of Scripture address some of the other situations where that wouldn't be appropriate.
Right. Though I think that part of the Sermon on the Mount that I'm quoting, I think that's a an immutable principle, right?
Yeah.
Not to return evil with evil, and to love our enemies. There's not like a time where we shouldn't not love our enemies,
Right.
even if loving them still means
Loving
protecting your family and defending yourself.
just because you love your enemy and pray for his salvation and repentance doesn't mean you're not
Right.
going to kill him if he doesn't repent.
Right.
Yeah, I just mention it because I know some of the listeners will be wondering, well, what about that turn the other cheek passage?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Right. Isn't it also a fact of history that the early Christians were, I don't want to say that they were like full on pacifists, but they stood out in the fact that they were willing to go to their deaths, and they were like living out Jesus's teachings like that, that turn the other cheek and live out that sort of moral ethic. And I believe that's how Christians were. There were a lot of martyrs, in the early church.
Yeah. There certainly were a lot of martyrs in terms of Christian pacifism. For a time in the 20th century, there was a viewpoint that was fairly common in scholarly circles. For example, the Quaker historian Roland Bainton was an advocate of this view that said Christians early on were just solid pacifists. They didn't think you could use violence in any circumstances until Augustine came along and developed just war theory. And it's certainly true that before Christians were in the majority in the empire, they didn't have to really wrestle with this question too much because they didn't have the responsibility for protecting a society. One of the things, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to put this as politely as I'd like, but pacifism is a luxury. Saying, oh, just we should never use violence. That's a luxury that you have if you don't have a responsibility for caring for other people. And so, to put it a little less politely, strict pacifism is sort of parasitical on people who are willing to use violence, because if you are a strict pacifist, you're depending on the people who are willing to use violence to protect you and ensure your safety. And as long as Christians were not in charge in the empire, they didn't have the responsibility of protecting everybody. And so they could have more of this luxury of not really having to grapple with this question. But subsequent to the 1970s, there has been more research done in this area that has suggested actually the picture even before St. Augustine is more complex than that. That the real question was not can you use violence, but can you join the Roman military? In part because joining the Roman military often meant swearing oaths by pagan gods. And so the real question was, could you be a soldier in this military and take orders from the Roman emperor and stuff like that? It wasn't violence itself that was the issue in a lot of cases. It was, can you be a Roman soldier in a way that's consistent with the Christian faith?
That's my understanding as well of the scholarship and the trend. But though even, of course, when we look at soldiers, we look at Roman soldiers, and it's interesting that Jesus doesn't like, hey, go quit your job.
Oh yeah, I pointed that out I point that out frequently in this connection, because when John the Baptist is preaching, it says soldiers came to him with tax collectors and said, what do we need to do? Because he's preaching repent. And he tells them, be content with your pay. He doesn't tell them quit being a soldier. He says, don't, just be content with your pay. Don't extort money from anybody. And otherwise you can be a soldier.
Right. And I don't know, Cameron, I don't know if this would be a good time to talk about it. I was just going to say, just kind of like, I imagine viewers could be watching Jimmy and I and you and thinking, wow, these people are like really un-American, or especially Jimmy and I, as we've, have said that the bombings were a terrorist attack in some sense, and we've said that that it was an intrinsically evil action, and that's not justified. And people might be thinking like, okay, these are just really unpatriotic individuals. I just want to say, first off, I do think that World War II is a just war.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I do not put the U.S. In the same category as, of course not, of the evil Nazi regime or
like a Taliban.
the Japanese country, or the Taliban or something like that. It was a war where there was evil committed by all sides, but the overall sort of amount of evil, or the overall drive for evil, I think was clearly one-sided. And so I just wanted to make that clear to I'm reading some of these comments on the right, and I just want to make clear that America they were the good guys in World War II, and I'm really thankful that we won World War II, and we should have fought in World War II. It's just that, unfortunately, both sides have blood and have and evil things that they did during this time. And that's what we just want to make sure we're calling this to everyone's attention, such that, Lord God willing, if we ever get in this sort of situation again, we won't go that sort of route.
Yeah, I would agree. And thank you, Tyler, for bringing that up. You and I being philosophers, it's kind of easy to get involved in an analytical discussion and not spot the impression that someone who's not used to that kind of discussion may have. I'm a patriotic American, and I love America. I'm glad we fought in World War II. Those Nazis needed punching, and I'm glad we punched them. That doesn't mean every single action that we did in World War II or any other war was perfect, because
Right.
people make mistakes. They have errors in judgment. And sometimes they act through anger or malice rather than reason. Though that's always understandable. I will say that despite what happened, we were much better in our actions in World War II than our opponents were.
Yep.
Our opponents were much more brutal and much more barbaric in what they did. We did some barbarous things. Firebombing cities full of civilians rather than just going after military targets, that's barbaric. So is dropping nukes on civilian targets with killing civilians as your goal. So those were barbaric acts, but our enemies were even more barbaric. So there's not a moral equivalence here. I want to be realistic and present history honestly and say, yeah, we made mistakes, and Hiroshima and Nagasaki were two of them. But that doesn't mean we were the bad guys. We weren't. We were the good guys, and we were much better and more civilized than our opponents were.
Much.
We weren't the ones doing kamikaze attacks on the Japanese. So thank you for bringing that up. By the way, as an illustration of how I try to be fair and balanced in presenting history, I'd like to just briefly mention, I actually did an episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. It's episode 113. It's called Desperate Coup in Japan. And what it does is it looks at a historical incident that is not very commonly known in the West. It's called the Kyujo incident. But what happened after we dropped the atomic bombs was the Japanese civilian government started having meetings saying, what are we going to do? Are we going to surrender or fight on, or what are we going to do? And you had a difference of opinion. The emperor eventually sided with the we should surrender unconditionally side of things, but not everybody agreed. There were powerful factions in the upper Japanese leadership that wanted to keep fighting, and they actually staged a coup against Emperor Hirohito and seized control of the imperial palace and had the emperor technically within their custody for a time. Very few Americans know about this because the American forces covered it up. They didn't want this news widely broadcast. But there was an actual coup over should they surrender or not, where you had Japanese high officials rebelling against the emperor's decision and taking him into custody effectively. So if you want to hear the story of the desperate coup in Japan and how others in Japan overcame the coup, check out episode 113 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. You can get to it by going to mysterious.fm/113. So that's mysterious.fm/113 for episode 113.
Yeah, and Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is one of the best podcasts that is available currently. So I highly recommend that you guys go check out that episode, but then listen to everything else that he produces. It's really, really good. Like really, really good. So,
Thank you so much.
No problem. I couldn't resist pulling up this question here for Tyler. Jimmy, feel free to comment on it as well. But Trad Kath says, Tyler, how many Americans were you willing to sacrifice?
Right. Well, Trad Cath, I assume the name is like traditional Catholic, unless I'm missing something here. In the Catholic tradition, it's never okay to do certain actions, right? Regardless of the consequences.
Yeah.
I can't, if all of a sudden someone took a child and said, all right, murder this child, mutilate the child, right? And if you don't, I'm going to kill an American soldier for every second you don't do it. Then I could ask, Trad Catholic, well, how many American soldiers are you willing to sacrifice, right? You know, how many is too much until finally you just mutilate the child? Well, mutilating the child is never okay, right? Similarly, intentionally dropping a nuke to incinerate hundreds of thousands of innocent individuals, right? Of children and women. Well, guess what? That's never okay either. And so I think the situations are analogous here.
Yeah, I would. So, Trad Catholic's question or Tradcast question is one that asks for a numerical answer, and it's obviously hard to put a precise numerical figure. But the first thing that occurred to me is, okay, so Tradcath, how many innocent children would you be willing to murder with your own hands in order to save 1 million American soldiers? And if you have a true Catholic sensibility, especially a traditional Catholic sensibility, the answer should be 0, that you wouldn't be willing to kill any innocent children with your own hands in order to save 1 million American soldiers. That you'd let the soldiers fend for themselves. Some of them might die, some of them might not, but you can't kill an innocent kid in order to save their lives.
That's what
Yeah,
we mean
so
by intrinsically evil action. It's not justified, and so you can't do non-justified actions. We can't do intrinsically evils. So anyway,
yeah, I think that's actually like the Captain America way of dealing with ethical issues, right? Is that he just doesn't do intrinsically wrong things, whereas other people will be like, no, the greater good is this. We need to
that's
do whatever
Thanos.
is necessary. Yeah, that's Thanos. That we need to do the greatest good, and so we're going to sacrifice this smaller portion of people for the good of everyone else. And so that's I was just gonna say that he keeps asking in the comments. He's like, how many are you willing to sacrifice? How many? And so I did want to kind of take that to the extreme though, and just get your intuitions on this. So suppose though that you knew that someone was going to murder, say, 1 billion children, unless you mutilated one. Would you still at that point? Would you still just hold out and be like, no, it's still intrinsically wrong, so it's wrong to do that, even if the consequences are 1 billion other children are going to die?
I would prefer it if we keep it apples to apples and say,
Okay.
would you be willing to murder one to keep 1 million others from being murdered? Because when you change the moral category, it's like, okay, so now what does mutilation mean? What is that? What are the practical consequences of that?
Okay, well, yeah, that's
yeah.
fine. We can just say murder. So if you were going to, save the lives of 1 billion children, and what you had to do was murder one of them. In the Thanos sense, like I think Thanos would do that immediately. But is that something that
because he's a consequentialist?
Exactly, a utilitarian consequentialist.
The principle, so Tyler mentioned this, or sought to root this principle in the Sermon on the Mount. It's even more directly stated in St. Paul, who at one point, this is in Romans, he's mentioning that some people have accused him of saying, let us do evil that good may come. And so that's a really clear approximation of the principle of double effect. You have these two effects, evil and good. We're going to do evil so that good may come. So we're using the evil as a means to get to the good. And he says their condemnation is deserved. That is not what he believes. This is a principle that's incompatible with the Christian faith. So I understand the consequentialist impulse, because we do need to take consequences into account. They are a major component of practical reason and of moral reason in many situations. But, and John Paul II discusses this in his encyclical Veritatis Splendor, but there are bounds to what you can do with consequences in moral reasoning. There are certain actions that are in and of themselves wrong and cannot be done no matter what the consequences are. And murdering an innocent person is one of those things. That's confirmed, for example, by John Paul II in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, where he says that this has already been infallibly defined by the church's ordinary and universal magisterium, knowingly and directly taking the life of an innocent person is never morally justified. And so, to Trad Cass' viewpoint or question, it doesn't matter what the numbers are. It doesn't matter how many people are going to be saved. I am not killing those people. I am not responsible for their deaths. What I am responsible for is what I personally do. And if someone tells me, I will spare 1 million children if you just kill this one with your own hands, I am responsible for my behavior. I'm not responsible for that horrible situation. I would be responsible for murder, which is an intrinsically evil act, if I killed a child with my own hands. Therefore, I can't do that no matter what the situation is.
That's a good distinction.
I just can't take responsibility for that situation, which I didn't even create. I am responsible for what I do.
Rhetorically, I think it's really effective to say something like, oh, okay, so it's okay to murder innocent human beings, or it's okay to murder innocent children under such and such circumstances. Okay, forcing the individual to say, well, yes, it is okay to murder innocent human children, even if they have the various parameters on it. I mean, I think that's quite rhetorically effective. Is just simply making clear that that's what they're saying. It's okay, at least in some contexts, to murder innocent children.
All right. I think now is a good time probably to move on and discuss the last couple parts of the movie, or the last couple aspects of the movie. Are you guys okay with moving on?
Oh, yeah. Yep. You had asked, I remember now, you had asked what happened to Oppenheimer later. Well, he did lose his Q clearance, so he lost his security clearance, and this tarnished his reputation in public for some time. Now, this happened in the late 1950s, and or in the 1950s anyway. And by the 1960s, he was experiencing something of rehabilitation. And people like John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson were taking a more sophisticated attitude towards him. The McCarthy era had passed, and the fears about Soviet infiltration were not as high, and that allowed something of a reappraisal of Oppenheimer. So he ended up having a partial reputation rehabilitation in the 60s. He died in 1967, and he, in his later years, was interviewed, and I've seen an interview with him from 1965 where they were asking him about the bomb and was this the right thing to do and how do you feel about it and so forth. And it's a very interesting and somber interview. He is very thoughtful, just like he's portrayed in the movie. He also is very cautious in his statements. He says, for example, like when he's asked, how do you and other scientists feel about that? He very quickly says, I can only speak for myself, but here's how I feel. And in asking, do you think this was all justified? He says, I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for that. So he did, and this is just 2 years before his death, he did continue to be very thoughtful and have very mixed feelings about his career and what he had done and whether this was justified or not. He certainly was not, what we did was right. It was definitely the right thing to do. He was not, as the father of the bomb, he was not entirely confident that what they had done was right. And so that's something that people who are very confident might want to think about, that even someone in his position wasn't confident of that.
Another really interesting question that I hadn't really thought of until you brought it up in our text thread while we were preparing for this is, well, what about Strauss? The guy, Robert Downey Jr. played Strauss, and I thought he did a really, really good job of portraying this character. But how is he regarded today? Like, was he regarded as a sort of good political figure, or neutral, or how is he regarded by people today?
Well, I haven't seen any polling on that, but I don't think most people today even know who he was. But Strauss, to use the, even though it's spelled Strauss, it's pronounced Strauss.
Strauss.
But he, and this comes across earlier in the book American Prometheus than it does in the movie. This, and I think as a dramatic choice, and I think it's actually a very good dramatic choice. Christopher Nolan holds back the identity of who it was that
Mm-hmm.
released Oppenheimer's security file, and you have people talking to Strauss about that. Who he is. He's a former head of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, and he had hired Oppenheimer after the war to be one of his scholars at the Institute for Advanced Study. And then he worked his way up to being appointed by President Eisenhower to the cabinet. He was going to become a cabinet official, but that requires confirmation by the Senate. And so one of the framing narratives in the movie is his confirmation hearings, and that's tied into the hearings because he knows one of the questions is he's going to be faced with is you hired Oppenheimer and he's lost his security clearance. Why did you hire him did you know that he had these left-wing communist connections in his past? And if so, why did you hire him anyway? And so he knows he's going to have to face that question. And he's got a couple of assistants who are helping him navigate this confirmation process. And they talk to him about, well, so who do you think it was that leaked Oppenheimer's security file that led back in 1954 to him losing his clearance? And at first, Strauss is saying, well, whoever it was, it had these effects and blah, 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 blah. And eventually it's revealed Strauss himself did it. And he did it as part of a revenge plan on Oppenheimer because he felt like Oppenheimer had humiliated him in public and he held a grudge. And that was true. Oppenheimer had humiliated him and he held a grudge. And he also thought Oppenheimer was poisoning other scientists' opinions against him, which is depicted in the film by him thinking that Oppenheimer said something to Einstein that turned Einstein against Strauss. And when we finally find out, it's like what Oppenheimer said to Einstein, it had nothing to do with Strauss. Strauss is just being an egomaniac and paranoid. And so he comes across in the film as a kind of villain. Well, in American Prometheus, they reveal much quicker that they don't hold it back to create drama that it was Strauss who leaked his file. They acknowledge that up front. And you really did have, now in the film, there's a scientist, I think his name is Hill. He's played by Rami Malek from Mr. Robot, who comes forth and he's testifying to Congress about what an egomaniac Strauss is and how he's running a cruel personal vendetta against Oppenheimer. Well, he's based on a real person who did that, but he wasn't the only one. They had multiple people come forward at the hearings and say he's got this cruel vendetta against Oppenheimer, and we think it disqualifies him from being the kind of person who would be suitable at the presidential cabinet level, that he can be that petty and that vindictive with people he disagrees with. And his nomination did tank. There had not been in like more than 25 years someone whose nomination failed. It was viewed in the beginning as a shoo-in, he's going to get in, but then he didn't. And he was viewed, certainly at the time, as a bit of a villain in this regard. Now, he also had supporters, but given that we now know he leaked Oppenheimer's security file as a way of getting back at him for personal petty reasons that were in part paranoid, he really does come across as a flawed figure who is kind of the villain of the piece. And I think, at least based on my knowledge, I'm sure he's a complex individual like anybody, but his actions as depicted in the film and in the book do paint him in a quite unflattering light.
Tyler, do you have any thoughts on that before we move on to the
No. No.
last topic? Okay. Well, the last aspect of the movie that we thought was worth discussing was, what do we make of Oppenheimer as a sort of moral figure? Because he is like depicted. Well, his title is what? The father of the atomic bomb. So what do we make of like him? And his role in developing this just crazy weapon of mass destruction. How should we view him? Should he have should he have denied the project, the Manhattan Project? Should he have just done his normal work and been working on what he was working on earlier? Or should he have engaged in this project and become the father of the atomic bomb? So what should we make of him as a sort of moral figure?
Tyler, you want to go first?
Yeah. To what degree he's responsible before God for overseeing the project and then all that's come from it, right? Everything that's the Cold War and even today, right? Living under threats with the West and Russia. That's between him and God. I have no idea what he's accountable to, what he knew or what he thought was right, and doing what he thought was right, given what he knew. That's beyond my ken. From a subjective point of view, right? From a sort of more objective point of view, yes, I think he shouldn't have worked on the project. I do think that that was something that, looking back, especially, has made the world worse. Yeah, I guess that's probably how I want to. I don't want to say he's guilty of this or guilty of that. I don't know how he was reasoning. I mean, the movie tries to portray a little bit of that, but truly, I don't know all the circumstances that he had, and the knowledge that he had, and so forth. In light of all that, I do objectively think that he shouldn't have done that. That it was wrong to do that, but subjectively, that's between him and God.
So I think I would take a somewhat different view. One of the things that, even though he's called the father of the atomic bomb, as Cameron alluded to at the beginning of this live stream, he didn't like invent it himself. What he did was he was the project manager to see it through to realization. But the actual ideas that were used in the atomic bomb were a collaborative effort that lots of scientists were thinking about this, because radiation had been discovered. And actually, some years earlier, the idea for the atomic bomb was actually proposed in a science fiction novel called The World Set Free by H.G. Wells. And scientists like Leo Szilard, who appears in the film, got a central insight. He actually designed how you could, in principle, and he got a patent on it, if I recall correctly. He designed plans for an atomic bomb. And then there's a question of how do you get it into actual production. The principal issue was not the theory, a simple gun model bomb. I mean, I can tell you how to make one. The central limiting factor is, how do you get the purified uranium you need? Because most of the uranium on Earth is not the right isotope. You need specifically uranium-235, and that's a small percentage of the uranium we have on Earth. But one of the things that is going to happen for any technologically advanced civilization is, as they become technologically advanced, they're going to learn about element 92 or uranium. And as they develop a little bit further, just like we did, they're going to learn about element 94 or plutonium. both of which are useful in making atomic bombs. And in fact, this is one of the proposed solutions to the Fermi paradox. By the way, Enrico Fermi also appears in the film, and he's famous for his paradox of, well, if there are aliens, where is everybody? One of the proposed answers for the Fermi paradox is every technological civilization encounters element 92 and element 94 and blows itself up before they can colonize space. Maybe that's true, or maybe there's another solution to the Fermi paradox. But it's something that has to be faced, and we were not alone. This was not all Oppenheimer's idea. There were multiple scientists in multiple countries who were working on this. We had a nuke. Yeah, we had a nuke program. The Germans had a nuke program. The Japanese had a nuke program, and the Russians had a nuke program. So, in my view, it was not, if we hadn't developed the bomb, it would have been developed anyway, and it would have been developed by one of our competitors. And so the best thing to do, when it would seem to me, there's no intrinsic difference between a nuke and another bomb. I mean, it's bigger, but there's no magic size threshold where above this level, it's intrinsically immoral, and below this level, it's intrinsically moral. So given that there's no intrinsic difference, it's just a bigger bomb that is more destructive than other bombs. Well, I can build other bombs in principle, so I don't see a reason you can't build a nuke. And given that multiple other competitor nations, including the Nazis and the Soviets and Imperial Japan, were working on this, we needed to get there first. And so I think it's arguable that, yeah, being the project manager to get us there first was a legitimate thing to do, and therefore Oppenheimer could be legitimate. And it seems to me that within that, if you make that decision, Oppenheimer then actually was quite reasonable about this. He was not advocating dropping the bomb on cities. He said it's not our role as scientists. We don't have that wisdom. I can present to the government the different opinions in the scientific community, but it's them who need to make the decision because they're the ones who are the experts in this. And I think he was right about that. He also, after the war, he continued to have very mixed feelings about this, but one of the things he did start doing was advocating controls on nuclear technology, on nuclear weapons technology. He wanted, for example, to have an international authority that would control this new technology so that it didn't get used irresponsibly by individual nations. He wanted to share, if I recall correctly, he wanted to share nuclear technology with other nations as a sign of America is not trying to rule the world on this. And if we're all on an even playing field, then we will counterbalance each other and we can all get along and not have this technology used in the future. Now, you can argue that was naive of him, or you could argue he was dead right on that. But whatever your opinion is, it seems to me that that despite his personal flaws, which we've already mentioned, it was fundamentally okay. At least I think it's arguable that it was fundamentally okay for him to lead this project so that the bomb wouldn't end up in the hands of our enemies with no counterbalance, in which case we'd be living in man in the high castle world. And he acted fairly responsibly, not claiming to have superior wisdom to everybody else. And after the war, advocating what he perceived as promising paths for controlling this technology to rein in its destructive potential.
Yeah, so I don't think I said it was intrinsically wrong.
I think you said he shouldn't have done it.
Yeah, just simply shouldn't have done it. So it would be I think it would be. I think he knew, and perhaps again, you know all this literature far better than I do. But from what I do know, from what I have read, it seems like he knew likely how it was going to be used, and that to me is where it's not maybe intrinsically wrong. I mean, we can imagine a situation, right, where imagine there are aliens that exist, and they come along and they say, "Make this nuclear bomb, and we won't invade you, and we won't even use a nuclear missile. You can right when you develop it, you can disarm it. We just want to see if you can do this, and if you can, we'll spare you." Right? Well, in that case, clearly, it seems permissible, right, to make a nuclear weapon. So I wouldn't say there's no justification for it, any sort of inconceivable justification for it. But I think given the context and the likelihoods of what was going to happen, I do think that's kind of what pushes me to say it's wrong. And of course, we can say, okay, what happens? What happens if someone else develops it? Um, well, uh, I mean, we can't use it on them. It's not like if we develop our own nuclear weapon, we can hit them before they hit us, unless of course maybe you have in mind nuclear weapons only on strategic targets. But then in that case, that seems like probably it's going to be overkill. And can we um, uh, bring about the same effectiveness without developing a nuclear weapon in reference to striking some sort of military target and that sort of thing? So it just seems way too dangerous. And no, given the context, the prior probability of it being used, your creation being used in this way, that's where my intuitions lean anyway. That's
Okay. Well, I don't want to drag out the discussion, but I think that Oppenheimer, in regard to his nuclear work, is a more complex individual than many people might give credit for, and he was arguably correct in his approach with regard to nuclear things, given the cognitive limitations that he had, what he did and didn't know. And so I would tend to take a somewhat generous approach to him in that regard. But I don't want to, belabor the point and drag this out unnecessarily.
no.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think actually this is a good time to kind of wrap up today's show and discuss maybe anything that you wanted to discuss, either Jimmy or Tyler, that we haven't yet talked about. In preparing for this show, there were so many different videos that I watched on just the power of these nuclear weapons, and it was just mind blowing to see what these things can actually do, and that really got me to think about how serious of an issue this actually is. And that's part of the reason why we wanted to do this show, is because it's just a super important topic. And we do plan to do more movie reviews, on sort of important movies that have kind of some overlap with Christian ethics and Christianity.
So you're saying you want to do Barbie?
Barbie is we're doing that next week. Just kidding. Yeah, no, we're not. There are no plans at this time to review Barbie. But Tyler, it looks like there's something. That
I was just gonna say, there's a show that I've watched. It's had its peak, it's had its climax, but I still watch it because I'm just like loyal like that. If I see the beginning, if I see so many episodes of a show, The Walking Dead, yeah, I just got to continue to watch it and so see how it concludes. Should have never killed my boy Glenn, but that's another story for another day.
Yeah, dude, I stopped watching after that.
Yeah,
shortly after that, I was like, I'm out.
Yeah. So, one of the big, I guess premise of the show is who is the Walking Dead, right? Is it? I mean, at first when you watch it, you're like, well, clearly it's the zombies. The zombies are the Walking Dead, right? And there's truth to that, obviously. But then as you continue on with the show, as you're watching it develop, you start seeing certain people behave in certain ways that are evil. You see people behave in ways where it's like, no, they're no longer human, right? Of course, you can't lose the image of God. But in some sense, right? It seems in some sort of poetic sense, we can say they're not even human anymore. They're dead. They are the dead walking. And how did they get that way? They get that way because they're trying to survive, right? They're trying to live as they see fit in a post-apocalyptic world. They try to avoid becoming dead so much that in doing so, they lose their humanity, and they are the real Walking Dead. In the same way, this is kind of how I look at the topic, right? We shouldn't be nuclear bombing civilians and cities and nations in order for us to survive, so to speak. Because in doing so, we lose our humanity. We repay evil for evil. We do evil, even if we hope that good may abound. Right? We do evil, and in doing so, we lose fundamentally who we are. And so I guess that's kind of the sort of warning that I kind of see from shows like The Walking Dead, and even to some degree when I watch Oppenheimer, is is to what extent are you willing to survive? Right? Are you willing to do evil to survive, or is there a limit? Anyway, that was my kind of final thoughts on everything.
Jimmy, any last thoughts?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to pitch once again episode 113 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where you can learn about what happened in Japan after we dropped the bombs and the dramatic events that happened there that the Japanese people had to wrestle with without us Americans even knowing about what was happening. So once again, it's episode 113. You can get it by going to mysterious.fm/113. Also, check out Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in general. I got lots of cool stuff. There's something for everybody. And you can do that by going to my YouTube channel, for example, which is youtube.com/Jimmy Akin, JIMMYAKIN. Also, I'll mention a couple, since Tyler mentioned a couple of fictional things that, or a fictional thing, The Walking Dead, that can be related to this. I'll mention a couple as well. Just a few years ago, there was a TV series called Manhattan, and it was about the Manhattan Project, but it wasn't as rigorously accurate as Oppenheimer is. It was a fictionalized version of the Manhattan Project, but it still was based on things that actually did happen. So, Niels Bohr appears in it, and a lot of the same stuff that happened in real life happened in it, but it's a slightly fictionalized version, and it focuses in particular on the creation of implosion bombs. It lasted for 2 seasons. And I enjoyed watching it, so I'd recommend checking it out. I watched it on Amazon streaming, so you can check out Manhattan. That's the name of that show. Also, another nuclear-related show or entity that I would recommend is the 1960s movie Dr. Strangelove, or How I Stopped Worrying and Learned to Love the Bomb. It's by Stanley Kubrick. It is a dark comedy, and wow, is it an interesting ride. So I'd recommend checking it. If you're interested in Oppenheimer, obviously watch the Oppenheimer movie, but if you're interested in this kind of Cold War nuclear stuff, check out the TV series Manhattan that lasted for 2 seasons. And also check out, if you just have a couple hours or so you want to invest in it, check out Dr. Strangelove.
And I'm just going to wrap up the show with inviting you, the audience, to share your thoughts on this show today. This is not a typical thing that we do. We don't typically review movies or get into these really deep ethical topics. So I'd like to get your feedback. If you'd like to see more of this type of content, if you'd like to see us review more movies and then tie that back into Christian philosophy, Christian apologetics, show how these things intermingle, and actually there is a lot of overlap between some of these popular cultural things that are happening like in movies and in the Christian apologetics world and community. So if you would like to see more of this type of content, please let me know in the comments.
Thanos death snap bad.
Yes.
Yeah, Thanos is bad, and you should be ashamed.
Captain America good.
Team Thanos. Yeah, Captain America good. So, but please let me know what you think about this show in the comments. I mentioned this almost every stream that I do actually read comments, trying to read more of them as of late. So thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you, Jimmy and Tyler, for joining me. If you'd like to learn more about my guests, check the description for links to all of their stuff. And we'll see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video very soon. See you guys later. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?